Sister, we talked about the beginning of the Cold War, and that's what the bell ringer was about, which we typed in the Canvas chat. Hopefully, you're able to submit the media document, which goes along with the two videos, typing in 10 facts on the left hand side for each video and each table, and then 5 interpretations. So, the notebook for today, we'll talk about changing tides in Europe. And the Cuban Missile Crisis had shown that it was possible to work together and that there were some weaknesses that did exist in the Eastern system. In fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis helped bring down Nikita Khrushchev. Some of the hardliners thought he was too weak, and so eventually he was forced out of the premiership and eventually replaced by a more hardline person, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev is Brezhnev. And he showed, of course, how hardline he was, because Russian forces ended up invading Czechoslovakia and removing the more lenient communist ruler of that country. And so the Brezhnev Doctrine basically said that the Soviet Union had a right to interfere in other communist nations whenever it felt that it was going to threaten the overall communist mission, or perhaps that of the status of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet forces were sent, and tanks were rolling down the streets of places within the country within a short period of time. But in the meantime, the Soviet Union and the United States continued to pursue a détente, DETENTE, with the first E with an accent over it. President Richard Nixon, who was one of the most anti communist presidents we ever had, and Brezhnev concluded that we needed to reduce the number of nuclear missiles that we had. And this would continue under Gerald Ford as talks increased and eventually concluded with the Helsinki Accord. Now, this did recognize the Soviet Union had control over Eastern Europe, but they had to protect human rights. Now, however, uh, ironclad that was is a good question, because how in the world were we going to enforce that? But anyway, President Jimmy Carter, of course, was more demanding that the Soviets follow the Helsinki Accord, and because of these demands, the Soviet Union ended up having a cooler relationship with the United States. And of course, the Soviet Union, still expressing the Brezhnev Doctrine, decided to interfere in the country of Afghanistan. The Communist Party there had gained power, had suffered some internal struggles and some challenges from others. And so eventually the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and were there for about a decade or so. The United States supported opponents, and the CIA funded militants of Islam in particular to fight against the Soviets, people known as the Mujahideen, which eventually some of them gave way to people that were in Al Qaeda or the Taliban. But because of this, the United States didn't sign another strategic arms agreement. They refused and competed with a grain embargo of Soviet wheat and decided to boycott the 1980 Olympics. So the United States and its allies did not send people to the Olympics in 1980. And the long, drawn out struggle in Afghanistan was kind of like what it was for the United States in Vietnam, leading to demoralization of the Russian people and declining support. In the meantime, they also started to show some fragility within Eastern Europe. Pope John Paul II, who was Polish, was incredibly critical of communism, and so protests eventually broke out in Poland, led by Lech Walesa, Walesa, and would occur across the country, especially as food prices, particularly meat, started to go up. The Polish Communist Party eventually was replaced by an independent union known as Solidarity, and then because of this, eventually one of the generals there would become head of the Communist Party and declare martial law, arresting the leaders of Solidarity. Then, of course, Ronald Reagan is elected, and he wants to intensify Cold War rhetoric and increase spending on the Pentagon and the branches of the military. And he would like to use his Strategic Defense Initiative, which eventually included a program known as Star Wars, in order to confront possible incoming nuclear missiles. The Russians, of course, would also increase in military spending in response, but they could not afford it, and that will eventually help lead to the economic collapse of the country. Britain, in the meantime, had been slowly rolling back its empire, giving way to Indian independence under Mohandas Gandhi, who used civil disobedience and peaceful protest in order to try to get freedom from Britain. And Gandhi led a number of other protests, like the Salt March to the Sea, because the British controlled the salt industry. He and others were imprisoned a number of times, participated in hunger strikes, and so but eventually by 1947, Britain would give way to Indian independence. But of course, the problem was is that what they counted as India also included Pakistan and Burma, which eventually would be split off from India. So India was partitioned into two states: India for the Hindus and Pakistan for the Muslims. Eventually, Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu extremist, though, one of his own people, because Gandhi is saying that we should work together with Muslims, but an extremist would not agree with that. East Pakistan would later break away to become the country of Bangladesh, which is one of the world's poorest countries. And India and Pakistan and their differences continue to exist as they both have nuclear weapons, and there are many always worried about the outcome if a conflict arises between the two. The British continued to retreat from other places like Burma and Sri Lanka, Palestine, Ghana, Nigeria from 1948 through 1960. They realized, of course, that it was very expensive in resources and people and other types of effects, diplomatic and political, in keeping up this empire. So that helped, I guess, convince them that some of these countries should be independent. So then they started to roll back from other places like Cyprus and Kenya and other places. Unfortunately, when they left, they didn't leave a lot of infrastructure, and that was typical of European countries. And so many of the nations that were left behind had high rates of poverty and instability. And of course, the most controversial place the Europeans would end up leaving would be France and Algeria. Algeria actually ended up being one of the departments of France because so many French people lived there, over a million, and they voted and elected people to the French parliament. But the Algerian native people, of course, were not allowed to participate necessarily in that system and were often deemed to be second class. So eventually, there were protests that erupted, and then eventually clashes between Muslims and the French. Both the Muslim and French civilians participated in terrorist activities, kidnappings, and murder, other types of things. And so that was an incredibly tense situation. So eventually, the Muslims formed the National Liberation Front in order to organize themselves and protest better under the banner of Algerian nationalism. Meanwhile, back in mainland France, they were evenly divided about what to do, to continue to keep the colony or let it become independent. So this eventually threw the country's government into chaos, and the new republic would be started under General Charles de Gaulle. And he will eventually allow a referendum that approves independence for Algeria by 1962. Now, Muslims, the French citizens that lived in Algeria and the Muslims that supported them eventually fled, coming to France, unless, of course, they ended up suffering the consequences. There's a picture of Charles de Gaulle there. And speaking of Algeria, that would not be the only place that the French would retreat from. They would also leave Vietnam. The communist leader Ho Chi Minh had only joined the communist movement because he wanted independence from France. And the French wanted to keep a hold of this particular colony, and especially after they lost Algeria, or as they were being challenged in Algeria, they felt that their empire was being weakened, that they had lost their footing since World War II, and so they attempted to stay the course in Vietnam because of all the tropical cash crops that were available. But despite military assistance in the form of advisors and money from the United States, the French end up losing Vietnam at their last battle at Dien Bien Phu. And when they leave, it is agreed that Vietnam, like Korea, will be split between North and South. But that doesn't last. The United States continues to support South Vietnam, but they too are challenged over a long grueling war. And so after the French leave in 1955, we're the main supporter of South Vietnam, but that is not able to hold much weight because South Vietnam is filled with corruption and brutal leaders like Ngo Dinh Diem, who ends up being assassinated by fellow South Vietnamese leaders with permission from the CIA of the United States. And then the communists in the north used the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong in order to infiltrate the South heavily, which means it isn't much of a country to fight on behalf of. And eventually, Lyndon Johnson, afraid of looking pro-communist after a ship is supposedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, which may or may not have actually happened, he ends up escalating the number of troops that are sent in the bombing campaign, which ends up leading to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese and over 58,000 Americans. And so eventually America turned sour on the Vietnam War. So President Nixon, despite putting a lot more punch when he first gets elected, expanding the bombing and attacks into Laos and Cambodia because supplies are running through those countries on what is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He puts forth that extra effort in order to try to embarrass or squeeze the North Vietnamese into making a more favorable peace terms. But in the end, he ends up leaving South Vietnam behind, which is eventually conquered by 1975 by the communists. And so this hurts America's prestige. And it basically led the way amongst the Western countries, especially in Europe. And so now people started to question that in particular. And really, the Europeans were of less assistance in Vietnam than they had been in Korea. There was almost a united front behind us during that particular war. All right. So for the remainder of the period, make sure that you turn in that media activity, and then you can work on the reading or something else that you haven't turned in yet from this unit or the review and test week.